right now talking about our nationwide investigation, Side Effects, that's looking into the cost of prescription drugs throughout the country. As we've been saying all along since the start of this thing, it ain't just the EpiPen. I'm joined now by a man who has a very long title, Ben Miller. He's with me here in Colorado. He is the director of the, I'm going to get this right without looking at my notes,
Do it.
the Eugene S. Farley Health Policy Center at the University of Colorado.
School of Medicine.
School of Medicine.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. We're also joined, and I'm going to pop people up on this while we do it. We're also joined by Dr. David Belk. You can just give us a wave right now. There you are. Dr. David Belk is with the True Cost of Healthcare. He's out in California. And also my colleague, Andy Parati, who is an investigative reporter at WXIA. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start off the questions right now. We're going to take questions from our viewers on Facebook as well. So please send us your questions. They're going to ask me them off camera, and hopefully we can get to as many questions as possible. But first of all, I want to ask Dr. I've already promoted you, by the way.
I am a doctor.
You are a doctor.
Yeah, you can call me whatever.
I'll call you Ben for the purposes of this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about prescription drugs.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that you talked about, we have a list now of 100 drugs that have increased in price by 70% or more just since 2012. And you gave me a very succinct answer.
Sure.
A lot of people want to say, well, why is this happening? Is it the evil drug companies? Is it the pharmaceutical benefit managers? There's a lot of sort of spokes in all of this.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it comes down to what?
It's because it can happen. And essentially, that's what the problem is right here, Chris. I mean, I think we'll talk a lot about this today. But the fact that we can have prices that continue to soar like they are, and they can do that, I mean, that's really what at the heart of this issue. What are we going to do about that? I mean, I hope we discuss that a little bit more today.
And we interviewed a mother that was getting insulin for her 4-year-old in our story that aired last night on KUSA. And she said, look, if they charge me $300 for a vial of insulin, I have to get it. If they charge me $1,200 for a vial of insulin, I have to get it. Because this is my daughter we're talking about. Is there a price that a mother won't pay for insulin for their daughter or their son?
No, I mean, and that's why this is such a big deal. The fact that we individuals have health conditions that require medications, it really forces us to say, well, I have to do this if I want to stay alive or if I want to stay healthy. And if the price is way beyond what I can afford, I still have to do it because what choice do I have?
So let's go now to Andy Parati. Andy in WXIA. Andy, thanks so much for joining us. You've done a lot of work on this as well. Let's talk about some of the key findings that you found in your investigation.
Well, last night's investigation really focused on how the FDA, while it does not regulate prices, there are some things that the agency does that can influence prices. And for instance, allowing drugs to get, generic drugs to get on the market faster, or allowing drugs that maybe have been on the market for years, all of a sudden repackaging them, rebranding them, and artificially increasing the prices for drugs that have been on the market for a long time. One of the examples that we used last night was a drug called colchicine, which had been on the market for a long time, decades, for like 50 years. A pharmaceutical company identified that it had not been officially approved by the FDA. They quickly did a study, and then all of a sudden a drug that costs about $10 for a month's supply is now $200. I know Dr. David Belk has been looking into this issue for a long time. He's looked at the prices and he's seen some trends. David, I don't know if you could hear me because I can't hear you, but I know that you're specifically having an article written in the coming days about generic drugs. There's some promising news about generic drugs, at least for this past year. Is that right?
Andy, I'm pretty sure he can't hear you, so I'm going to ask that question myself. Dr. Belk, you're up live now. You are talking about Andy wanted to know about some promising news in regards to generic drugs that you're going to be talking about fairly soon. What can you tell us what's happening on that front?
Well, I was going over the prices of generic medications. I track about 1,240 generic listings on what are called the NADEC prices. These are CMS tracks the price that retail pharmacies pay for the medications they buy. And what I discovered was they started tracking them in the fall of 2012, and they track them every single month. I was following about 1,240 listings, so it was a very comprehensive list. And there was an insane amount of inflation for many generic medications in, for example, 2013 and 2014. But apparently, according to my results, that inflation has all but stopped in the last year. And interestingly enough, of the 1,240 listings I was tracking, the average price actually went down since January of this year. It's really hardly budged at all in the last year. The inflation of generic medications is now less than the national rate of inflation. And for comparison, in 2013 alone, the average these generic medications went up was 55% in a single year. Now, I should add a corollary to that. Not every medication was going up. In fact, almost as many medications dropped in price as went up in price, but you had medications going up 5, 10, 50 times in price, which was, for example, doxycycline in 2013 went from about 6 cents a pill to $4 a pill in a single week. And you had these insane price spikes that were going on for the last 2 years, for 2013 and 2014, that have all but stopped so far this year, which is good news.
Well, we need some good news in this argument. We've got now, as I pop us back up, we've now got a question from the audience, and my colleague Katie Wilcox is going to shout it out to me. What's the question we got?
So we have a couple questions so far, but the first one is just the big question is, if it's so expensive that you really can't afford it and it's something you need, what are you supposed to do about it?
I'll let Ben answer that one first.
Wow. Well, this is at the heart of so much of what's plaguing people in our society. When you don't have choices and you actually have to choose these medications and you say, well, here's the one that I get, and this is how much it costs. What do I do? Hasn't told them there's a cheaper alternative.
But you find that all the time. That's not just true with pharmaceutical prices.
Yeah.
You find that all the time that physicians simply do not know the cost of the things they're advising their patients to get. How can we as patients ask better questions of our doctors?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first questions that you can ask as a patient going in to talk to your provider is you could say, okay, here's the medication you've recommended for me. How much is this medication going to cost me? If it's going to cost a lot, is there a cheaper alternative? And being able to ask those questions, just being informed on those two very basic questions, I actually think opens up an entirely different dialogue that you as a patient can have with your provider.
Dr. Belk, I'm going to bring you into this discussion. I want to ask you in terms of what advice do you give to patients that are sort of find out the sticker shock of the drug price when they show up at the pharmacy or they go online and they look at the cost of that drug and they're like, I can't afford that. What do you tell them?
Okay, it's an incredibly opaque business, so I should clear up a few things. Most doctors don't know how much a medication is going to cost a patient because they don't have an easy way of finding out. If it's a brand name medication, and when you're talking about the price of prescription drugs, you really have to break it into two categories, brand name and generics. If it's a brand name medication, then chances are you can't afford it without your insurance. And what your insurance copay is going to be is not readily available. Basically, you have to call the pharmacist, say, I'm prescribing Mrs. Jones X medication. How much will it cost Mrs. Jones? Now, if Mrs. Jones has bought the medication at the pharmacy, the pharmacist can enter the insurance information and give you a quote over the phone, but it takes time. That is the only way you can find out how much a medication is going to cost a patient who uses their insurance to buy it. The pharmacist literally has to type in their information, type in the medication, see if it's approved, and so on. It's not easy. Now, if it's generic medication, it's much easier. I'm going to plug a website, GoodRx. I use it all the time. Same with healthwarehouse.com. You type the name of the medication in, benazepril, and you can see the cash price for 30, 60, 90, 180 pills. And usually, in most cases, if it's a generic medication, patients know. You might have a $10 monthly copay for benazepril. Well, I'll tell you, go to goodrx.com or healthwarehouse.com or call up Costco. You'll find you can buy that benazepril 20 milligrams for, maybe $35 for a whole year or less than $20 for 6 months. And if it's a $10 monthly copay, you're saving a lot of money. So generic medications are often cheaper than the price of the copay if you shop around. Now, retail pharmacies don't like to tell you that because retail pharmacies would rather you use your insurance. So if you go to CVS or Walgreens, they're not too happy to sell it to you for the cash price, and oftentimes their cash prices are quite high. But you can go to places like Costco, Walmart, Kroger's, and healthwarehouse.com and buy these medications for a lot less. So if it's a generic medication, check the price directly on one of those websites. If it's a brand name medication, you have to use your insurance, and the pharmacy can only tell you how expensive it is if they have your insurance information and the name of the medication.
I love the fact that transparency is sort of coming into the market, creeping into the market. Websites like GoodRx are sort of out there that sort of inform patients in terms of what cost can be. I'm going to take another question from Katie.
Okay, this question might be for Andy. It's about what do other countries do? Why are drugs cheaper in other countries as opposed to here? And why aren't we importing them? Can people buy their drugs from Canada, for example?
Andy, did you hear that question?
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, I did hear that question. That's a great question. So, according to a recent report by JAMA, there are 19 developed countries in the world that have direct negotiations with pharmaceutical companies for their drug prices. So, their governments directly negotiate on behalf of its citizens. The United States does not do that. In fact, they even go a step further to make it more expensive for taxpayers. In 2003, Congress passed the law, Medicare Part D, which subsidizes drug costs for the poor and elderly. Inside that law, members of Congress actually made it illegal for the federal government to negotiate drug prices on behalf of that program. So since 2005, it went from about $1 billion spent on that program to last year $89 billion. And this goes into a great question that we also had on Facebook. Karen Reedus, she asked, how is it legal for Congress to accept donations? It is legal. And in fact, just to put in perspective of why you may think some of these members of Congress are really fighting for the right thing, for reform, you know, those members of Congress that were on that hearing, that were grilling that CEO of Mylan, the maker of the EpiPen, they were really going after it, made headlines on all the networks where those same lawmakers accepted over $366,000. So while it may not be illegal, some people certainly believe that there's some ethical issues involved with that.
Andy, I want to ask you, one of the things we heard over and over from our legislators here in Colorado, I know you've interviewed a number of legislators in Georgia, we hear this over and over again. Well, I don't know who's giving me money. I don't know who's contributing. I'm not influenced by their cash. Is that something you heard in Georgia as well?
Absolutely. Representative Buddy Carter, who was on that hearing that grilled the Mylan CEO, he's a pharmacist. He's the only pharmacist in Congress. And you would think that a pharmacist would know whether pharmaceutical companies are donating to his campaign. In an interview that we did that will be broadcast here in Atlanta later tonight, he says he didn't know that he had $14,000 in campaign contributions. Now, I'm not saying that this person or many members of Congress see this as an issue. I'm just saying when it comes down to the vote, when it comes down to passing reform, and by the way, there are more than a dozen proposed bills in Congress right now that would have some sort of influence, they claim, in reducing drug prices or at least having more availability of cheaper drugs on the market. When it comes down to them actually voting, that's what we have to really pay attention to, because they can say, give us an earful of empathy of how much America is hurting because of these drug prices. But if they're not voting for these things, that's when we really have to hold them accountable.
Ben, you wanted to add into this discussion.
Sure. I think it's important for the folks that are listening in on this to understand the difference between the United States and other countries. So if you look at 2013 data, the United States per capita spent $858 on pharmaceuticals, on drugs. But if you compare that to other 19 industrialized nations across the world, they only spent $400 per capita. So that difference right there is astronomical. And if you ask yourself the reason why, and I think it was probably alluded to just now, because the market will bear that in the United States. The market allows for that to happen, where a drug company can essentially say, I'm going to pay this amount or I'm going to charge this amount, and people will have to do it if it's the only drug that's on the market.
Excellent point.
So some folks want to kind of talk politics and they want to talk policy. What can they change? And is this a Republican or Democrat issue?
I'm going to pose that question of Dr. Belk. Dr. Belk, we get a lot of people that ask us questions about policy, who's responsible. What can people do to sort of raise their voices with, and you've done a lot of raising of your own voice. What can people do to sort of combat this in terms of on a political level?
Well, I don't really want to be in the position of pointing fingers.
And I don't want you to do that. But I would say, from a bipartisan perspective, how could we sort of influence this?
Yeah, well, I've always been fighting for transparency. In other words, one of my chief arguments has been, if we ever saw these prices, or whenever we do look at these prices, a lot of these gimmicks start to go away. For example, when a brand name medication just goes over the counter, it will usually drop about 90% in price. And I mention all of the time that when a brand name medication goes generic, it drops by as much as, well over 90% in price. But several of the things that need to be approached is that, for example, the FDA needs to be reformed. I didn't hear any of Andy's answer, so I have to apologize if I'm repeating what he was saying. But the FDA currently gets 2/3 of its budget to oversee the pharmaceutical companies. 2/3 of the budget they have for overseeing the pharmaceutical companies comes from the pharmaceutical companies. So you have to wonder how much that's influencing their decisions to allow medications to keep their exclusivity, to keep, for various patents that might be, less than reasonable. And yeah, you have to wonder why Congress actually passed a law. It's not just that CMS doesn't negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. Congress passed a law forbidding CMS to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. And I'll throw this right out there. The private insurance companies have absolutely no interest in negotiating with pharmaceutical companies. They benefit from higher prices. So it's, I guess we as Americans simply have to be more aware of what's going on. These are complicated issues. And the very complexity of the issue is how they can hide from us what they're really doing from us. If people don't understand what's going on, then it's far easier to take advantage of them, which is one of the reasons that I have my website. I try to explain as clearly as I can what's really going on.
I love the idea, lost in the healthcare shuffle is this idea, this nothing's transparent. It's not just pharmaceuticals, it's everything in healthcare, and just anything that brings a hint of transparency into this argument I think is very beneficial. Let's go to the next question.
And that's great that you bring up transparency, because I'm not making this up. Lauren Lanning asked, what is the need for PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, and why do insurance companies pay them so much? If you ask the drug companies to explain the price hikes, they blame it on PBMs.
As we sort of talk about pharmacy benefit managers here at KUSA in Denver, we sort of have walked people along through this week. At the beginning of the week, we were giving the basics, the health insurance 101 of what a copay is, what a deductible is, what coinsurance is. I sort of consider PBMs sort of the advanced study of health insurance. But pharmacy benefit managers are an integral part, and I'm going to bring Dr. Belkin back in this because I know you've talked a lot about this in terms of pharmacy benefit managers and why should people care about the money that pharmacy benefit managers are bringing in?
Well, I argue pharmacy benefit managers wouldn't exist if people knew more about them, but that's my argument. They first came into existence in the late 90s to sort of help with negotiating and finding the lowest prices when this was a time when most medications prescribed, most prescriptions filled were actually brand name and expensive. All right. And one thing people should be aware of, in 2015, 5 out of 6 prescriptions filled in this country were for generic medications, not brand name medications. Now, I said earlier, oftentimes when you buy a generic medication, your insurance copay for that medication is more expensive than the price of the medication. Here's what pharmacy benefit managers do. They are the entity that approves or disapproves of your medication, whether or not you can buy it. So you wonder who it is that's deciding whether or not, you're allowed to buy this medication, whether it's, first tier, second. That's your pharmacy benefit manager. All right? And they set the copay you will pay for it. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you go to a retail pharmacy like Walgreens, and let's say you pay $10 for your blood pressure medication, well, that blood pressure medication probably costs the pharmacy only about, $1. So you would think, well, that's $9 profit for the pharmacy. Not exactly. The pharmacy benefit manager will split that copay with the pharmacy when the copay exceeds the price of the drug by a certain amount. So if you pay $10 for $1 worth of generic medications, then, the pharmacy benefit manager gets 4 and the pharmacy keeps 6. Okay, well, that's not a very good deal because they can set any copay they want on your generic medications. The other role they play is when you buy a brand name medication, which usually costs the cash price anywhere is going to be several $100s a month for most brand name medications. Well, then it's a little bit different. The pharmacy benefit manager has to cover the cost of the medication. They have to cover the pharmacy's cost because the pharmacy can't sell it for less than what they pay for it. Okay, so you buy your medication, you pay your copay, the pharmacy benefit manager covers the rest, and then the pharmacy benefit manager gets a rebate of an unknown amount from the pharmaceutical company, which is why they decide that medication is covered as tier 1 as opposed to tier 2 or to tier 3 or not covered at all, right? And so it gets really, really messy when we're talking about the opacity of prices because pharmacy benefit managers are not only raising the cost of generic drugs by taking a cut of your copay, they are getting these unknown rebates from the pharmaceutical companies to list that drug preferentially over other drugs. So it really is kind of a mess. And since 5 out of 6 medications that we doctors prescribe, 5 out of 6, prescriptions filled are for generic medication, far more often the pharmacy benefit manager is just going to raise your out-of-pocket price for a prescription that you could easily afford for cash, more easily afford for cash. So they don't really provide much of a service.
I'm very interested in the discussion that talks about we have a situation where many people in this country are going over to high deductible healthcare plans, and they're not necessarily the beneficiaries of those rebates. And it'll be interesting to see how that works itself out in the future. Kitty's got another question.
We've had several questions, but one that's been coming up a lot is this idea that the federal government has too much red tape, and that's helping sort of monopolize the market. I know Andy has done some reporting on that.
Andy, I want to bring you in on that. Andy, did you hear that question?
Yeah, can you repeat?
Yeah, repeat the question.
So it's just about how the federal government is sort of using their red tape to give certain companies a monopoly.
Yeah, this idea that the current situation that as it exists right now allows this bureaucratic red tape to sort of get in the way of innovation and newer drugs getting on the market. You've done a lot of work on that. Talk about that.
So the FDA disagrees. They say over the past year or so that if you put in an application for a brand new drug, that if it's correct, there's no errors in it, that it can be approved within 10 months. That's their goal 90% of the time. Obviously, goal and in reality isn't the same. many members of Congress, and there's actually a bill in Congress right now that would help expedite some of these things, specifically generic drugs. There is a backlog of generic drug applications that are waiting for approval. Many of them have been waiting for years before they implemented a new program that added more funding to the program to get more people's eyes and working on these applications. So there is an issue with this, or members of Congress wouldn't be holding hearings on it. There wouldn't be some legislation filed, but the FDA believes that they're doing a good job, and partly because of the user fees that they're getting to help pay for some of the expediting of some of these drugs. And why I'm talking about user fees, and I hope I'm not getting too detailed here, is it important to mention that there is an argument of whether the FDA has our best interests at heart when it comes to approving drugs that have been on the market for years, all of a sudden now rebranded as a brand new drug because they can bind, 3 drugs into one, and all of a sudden that's super innovative, and now they have, exclusivity and monopoly on that drug. The FDA, half of its funding comes from Big Pharma. They rely on those user fees. And last year, they received about $2.2 billion from those user fees. So you have to wonder, is the FDA really looking out for us when the industry that they're supposed to be policing and regulating, they're getting money from? Chris?
Excellent point. Let's go to the next question.
So we have had a couple of people just talk about how they are having to opt out of buying things that they really need. A lot of people are really fearful and just want to kind of know what are their options. Can we talk about?
I'm gonna bring Ben back into this discussion on that. This is a reality for so many Americans in this country, whether it be emergency room bills or whether it be bills for insulin. This is a reality that people are facing, and you work on this on a daily basis. What do you say to them?
One of the things that I think has to be realized is that we as individuals, everybody is going to be a patient at some point in their life. And so this reality of how much stuff costs and how it's going to hit us and where it's going to hit us and the choices that we have to make, there's something that we have to do about this. It's natural that healthcare will evolve, sure. I mean, we can say that it's going to evolve and we're going to figure out ways to control costs and all this other good stuff. But it's something different when we, as the patient, the consumer, begin to establish this revolution where we actually demand more for our healthcare. Where we start to say, well, you know what, this status quo stuff that I've been given, this is insufficient. I want something better for me because what I'm frankly paying for is not good.
Do you think the advent of more transparency along the way for things like GoodRx and other websites that are sort of broadcasting to the masses true cost, that combined with the fact that we now have 51% of this country that has a deductible over $1,000 or more, is that revolution going to be sped by those two things?
I think it'll help. But some of the studies that are coming out right now looking at transparency tools, just as one example, people don't necessarily use them. They need to use them, but they haven't been educated on how best to use them. And when they do use them, sometimes they choose poorly. And this goes back to the heart of American culture. I think we've got this mentality where if it costs more, we must think it's better. And that's not really true in healthcare. There's a lot of things that cost a ton of money in healthcare that actually don't get you better quality or better outcomes. Those transparency tools, when they actually take into account the quality and the outcome, allow us, the end user, the consumer, the patient, to make better decisions.
Puts a lot of responsibility in the hands of the consumer, which I think is what is happening in healthcare in general these days.
Absolutely.
Would you guys like to take them through the website a little bit?
Yeah, let's go. Let me see if I can bring this up. And hopefully you can still hear me. That's our website right now. That's on 9news.com. And I'm not sure if we're going to be able to scroll through this because I'm not controlling the website. But if we want to go ahead and scroll through it, we'll get a general idea of what we built. And this is sort of a template that's in existence throughout all of the Tegna stations. I want to see if she can click on the top story and give you a better idea. Well, right there is where you can sort of give us your own personal information in terms of how these prescription drug price increases are impacting you. I think really the goal of a lot of this is that we know a lot of people have stories out there that need to be told, and we want this to be a platform for people so that they can go to and tell us their stories and say, this is what the drug, this is the kind of drug that I'm having to pay for, and these are the kind of drugs that I just simply can't afford. On this page that you're looking at right now is our sort of graphic animation of the 100 drugs that are on our list that have increased in price by 70% or more. This gives you an idea. Those dots, the biggest dot on the right is tetracycline. As we talked, tetracycline has gone up substantially in price, but it's also to the point I talked to some pharmacists, and they say they really don't even prescribe it. They may go through a month and maybe give out 3 or 4 prescriptions for tetracycline. But there's other drugs. Duexis, I see that they're clicking on right now. That's a drug that's increased. If my eyes were better, I could see a lot of those things right now on our screen, but my monitor is very, very small. Niacin is another drug on our list. So this is something that we urge everyone to sort of play around with. And in addition, we never meant this list to be all-encompassing. We know there are other drugs out there that have also increased in price substantially, and we want to hear from you about those drugs. I've already gotten a significant number of emails telling us, you need to look into this drug, you need to look into that drug, and I think that's wonderful in terms of what we all can do to sort of share our stories. Katie?
Some folks have asked us about generics, and why aren't there generics available for my drugs, and why are generics increasing?
I'm going to pose that question to Dr. Belk. Dr. Belk, we got a question that talks about there's a lot of the generics that are available, but why? Repeat that question again one more time, Katie.
A couple of things. Why aren't there generics for these old drugs?
Why aren't there generics for a lot of these older drugs that are on the market right now, and why sometimes are generics just not available?
Yeah, the availability of generics depends on the marketability. Some old drugs are what you might call orphan drugs, where they're so infrequently prescribed that generic companies don't see a point in making it. Every once in a while, a generic drug is taken off the market simply because, for whatever reason, this goes back into the games the FDA plays with the pharmaceutical companies. A pharmaceutical company will gain exclusivity on that drug from the FDA by finding a new indication for it, for example. So if a pharmaceutical company, for example, finds out that a drug that's old and has been on the market for a long time does something that no one else had proven it had done before and submits it to the FDA, sometimes the FDA will grant that company exclusivity, and then there's only a brand name available for up to 3 years. This was done most famously with a drug called colchicine about 10 years ago or so. I don't remember when. So there's a number of reasons, but the primary reason that you don't find a generic medication on the market that I have found is simply drug companies stopped making it because they weren't selling any of it. You have a number of what are called Me Too drugs, where you have 6 or 7 or 8 drugs that do exactly the same thing, and some are more popular than others. And so the ones that are less popular might not be made.
Let's go to the next question.
So I think one really that stood out to me is just when it's 6 p.m. at night and I need meds for my sick kid, I'm not going to shop around. Why don't we have consumer protection in this industry?
I'll ask that first of Ben, and then I'll ask that of Andy. We're really, in many ways, defenseless, subject to the pricing whims of pharmaceutical companies, PBMs, and everything in healthcare.
Well, this is where I think we have to realize that healthcare is a morass of competing interest. And I'm going
to write that down, by the way.
Thank you. Write that down.
Morass of competing interest. That's good.
It's a morass of competing interests where there are multiple enterprises, businesses, companies that really don't necessarily have the end user in mind. Now, I think a lot of our frontline clinicians, a lot of our health systems are really aiming to try and create more patient-centered approaches to care. But really, if you want to be truthfully and brutally honest about this is why we talk about it as a wealth care system, not a healthcare system. Health is the foundation for achievement, and very rarely do we see opportunities for organizations or businesses, especially pharmaceutical companies, to say, oh, you know what, let me take into account how much this is going to cost you and how you are not going to be able to pay for this.
What's interesting is that you're starting to see some companies, and Andy, I'll bring you into this discussion. You're starting to see some companies that are, particularly pharmaceutical companies, are telling us, we are now committed to single-digit price increases over the course of our company's future now. We just saw Valiant, a company that's been in the news a ton. Its stock price has gone down substantially, and Valiant now puts out a press release telling us we're committed to these lowering price increases. Andy, do you see a movement to possibly change this discussion from the sort of the massive price increases that are documented on our list?
I think there's no question that there's going to be more discussion into it, and there's probably going to be a movement, especially with EpiPen being the potential cause for that movement. And then you have all these bills that are pending right now in Congress that would address some of these things. One of the things that I wanted to point out that Ben kind of hinted on, in my opinion, is that these companies, pharmaceutical companies, pharmacy benefit managers, insurance companies, it's almost as if they don't want you to do research. And here's what I mean. You get insurance. You expect that when you go to the pharmacy, your copay is the lowest amount that you would have to pay. And what's interesting is that if you went to your pharmacy right now, you had a prescription, and your copay was $50, you're assuming that's the best price. Well, what you don't know is under that pharmacy benefit manager contract is that your pharmacist is actually not even allowed to tell you that, hey, by the way, if you purchase this with cash, it would cost you less than your copay with your insurance. That doesn't make sense. There's something wrong with that. And I think that's something that members of Congress have to address in this next legislative session. And I think the biggest news in healthcare that you're going to see over the past few years is addressing the pharmacy benefit manager issue. There is a bill in Congress right now filed by Georgia Congressman Collins. He is trying to get more transparency in the process. There's a reason why their numbers, the amount of money that they're making are quadrupling into the billions of dollars. They make more money than Disney and McDonald's put together. So, and most people don't even know they exist, but they're supposed to be doing us a favor by negotiating drug prices. So you do have to do your homework, and you do have to assume that they don't want you to do your research, that you're looking for the best price. One
of those ways that you can do research on that topic that Andy's discussing right now is simply Google the term Anthem versus Express Scripts. If you are at home right now, Google, there's a massive lawsuit that's taking place, and we're going to be doing a story on it at KUSA tomorrow night on our air, talking about this massive lawsuit that Anthem is, the PBM for Anthem is Express Scripts, and Anthem is alleging, at least in the lawsuit, that their customers have been overpaying for drugs for a number of years because of the number of things that Andy's been talking about. But I think Andy hit it on the head right there. There's a lot of people in the process that just simply don't want you to do your research, and they make it difficult for you to do research.
That's why I think broadcasts like this and information that you all are all doing together are so important, is because the average consumer doesn't get this information. They don't have it available. They can't just go there and say, let me search and find what's the cheapest drug that I can use right now. And I think this is why we have to continue to educate. Knowledge is power, but education is insufficient. We have to be able to take this knowledge and do something with it. We, as consumers, as patients, as people, have got to demand more from this.
I think this will be our last question.
If we were going to take one last question, I think it'd be this. Is this across the board? Is this all RX? Is this all prescriptions, or is it just one type?
Dr. Belk, I'm going to bring you in on this discussion. The question is this all prescription drugs? Is this one types of prescription drugs? Is this across the board? I know you talked about generics have sort of stabilized in terms of price, but when we talk about brands, have you seen any trends with trends with brands?
Yeah, I did a study of about 400 brand name listings as well, including brand name listings that already have generic equivalents. And I find that for the last 4 years, each and every year, they've gone up. They've had double-digit inflation, anywhere from 12 to 18% every year. So nearly every brand name listing I've found has gone up in price, and the average that they've gone up has been about 75% over 4 years. And let's keep in mind, if you have a generic medication that costs 2 cents a pill and it doubles in price, that's not nearly as bad as if you have a brand name medication that's $20 a pill that goes up 10% in price or 50% in price. So, it's a little deceptive when you're talking percent increasing, because brand name medications and I like to stress this, brand name medications cost an average of about 100 times as much as as the exact same generic medication. So Lipitor, which is a brand name cholesterol medication, costs pharmacies about $6 to $8 a pill, whereas the generic version is about 12 cents a pill. So anywhere from 50 to 200 times the price. So when brand name medications are going up 10 or 15% in price every year, that can be a lot worse than, a lot of generic medications, even when they're doubling. Not that generic medications doubling is a good thing, but it's two very different economies simply because the scale is so much different.
That's an excellent point, and I want to bring in Andy. We're about ready to close this up. Andy, do you have any closing thoughts in terms of the work that you've done over the last few months? Anything that you'd sort of want to leave the people who are watching this Facebook Live with?
I think it's just staying engaged, staying informed, and don't assume that the pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, and the pharmacy benefit managers are doing things in your best interest. Stay engaged in this process. This isn't going to go away overnight, and as you can imagine with campaign contributions flowing into Congress, it's not likely to change anytime soon, but it doesn't mean that it has to stay this way. Tonight here in Atlanta, we're going to be talking a little bit more about those campaign contributions and how they've influenced lawmakers' decisions and how they've likely helped the pharmaceutical industry make a lot of money. So here in Atlanta, that's what you can expect tonight. I know that you've got a lot more coming your way there in Denver.
Thanks so much, Andy. And one closing thought from Ben.
Don't be afraid to talk to your clinicians about these issues. Don't be afraid next time you go to the doctor to say, hey, listen, how much does this cost? And are there cheaper alternatives? This is how we begin to change the culture of healthcare, when we as the consumer start to ask the right questions. I couldn't agree with Andy more. A lot of this is going to be on us. There's going to be policy and regulation change that are inevitable. But much of this is going to come down to what we as the average consumer want to do.
Yeah, I'm going to leave. You guys have all been positive, so I'm going to leave with a negative. I worry that the status quo, I've been saying this to anybody willing to listen over the last few months as working on this. I still worry, you see the amount of money, and we've done a lot of work on this investigation in terms of the money changing hands. I still worry that the status quo is making a lot of people a lot of money. And at the end of the day, when that happens, it becomes very difficult for patients like us to fight back. But now let's switch it a little bit and let's make this positive. Everything that Andy said, everything that Dr. Belk said, everything that Ben said, in terms of bringing ourselves closer to transparency and being more educated as patients, is a net positive. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We've got Dr. Belk. We've got Andy Parati in WXIA in Atlanta, and we've got Chris and Ben in KUSA in Denver. That's our website. Sorry, I messed that one up. And there's us, coming to you from KUSA in Denver. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. This has been a great discussion, and let's continue this discussion throughout the week on Facebook, on Twitter. Take advantage of everything that is out there right now because there's a ton of information for everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. And fade to black.